Welcome back, everybody. We're diving deep today into a really interesting part of the superhero world. It's Sony's Spider-Man universe. You know, the one where they're making movies about all of Spider-Man's
But
villains.
without Spider-Man himself.
Yeah, well, almost. I
Almost.
mean, we see baby Peter Parker and Madam Web, but that's it.
Right. It is a very interesting strategy. You'd almost say it's like they're trying to have their cake and eat it too.
Exactly. And here's what's crazy. These movies are making a ton of money, but critics are just trashing them. Like rotten ratings across the board. What is the deal? What is going on with this weird corner of the Spider-Verse?
Yeah. The article we're looking at today, it's by Paul Tassi from Forbes. It's called Venom. The Last Dance Reviews Secure a 100% Rotten Sony Spider-Verse. And it has some really interesting thoughts about this. So by the end of this deep dive, you'll understand why people are so divided on these Sony movies. You might even have some ideas about what's next for them.
All right, so let's start with the basics. Sony owns the rights to a whole bunch of Spider-Man characters, so they can make movies about Venom, Morbius, Kraven the Hunter, whoever they want, without even putting Spider-Man in them.
Yeah. It's a unique situation. They're basically trying to make their own version of the MCU, but it's only Spider-Man villains.
So Sony's just running around making this Spider-Man-less Spider-Man universe. But let's talk about how people feel about these movies. Like I was saying, the article makes it clear critics don't really like them. I mean, every single movie in this universe has a rotten rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Every single one. This is not like one or two movies that flop. This is like critics consistently disliking these movies. Venom. Let There Be Carnage, for example. 57% on Rotten Tomatoes. And the new one, Venom, The Last Dance. Even worse, only 37%.
And it's not just Venom. The first Venom has a 30%. Then there's Morbius at, what was it, like 15%.
15%.
And Madam Web is dead last with something like 11%. Oof.
That's gotta hurt.
That's got to sting a little bit.
But here's where it gets interesting. Critics are giving these films terrible scores, but the audiences actually seem to like them, especially the Venom movies.
Yeah, it really is a riddle. Because the article points out that if you look at the audience scores, they're way higher than the critic scores for all of the Venom movies. Like, Let There Be Carnage has an 84% audience score. And even The Last Dance, you know, the one that critics hated, it still has a 77% audience score.
Yeah, a huge difference.
Huge.
Why are audiences enjoying these movies when critics are not? What is it about, especially these Venom movies, that's working for reviewers?
I don't know, maybe it's the whole anti-hero thing. I mean, Venom, he's a villain in the comics, but people always kind of liked him. He's got that bad boy rebellious thing going on. Maybe that's what's connecting with the audience.
Maybe. Maybe critics are looking for something deeper, more complex, but people just want to see some fun action.
And then you've got Morbius. The article even mentions this. It got destroyed by critics, but online.
Yeah.
A meme sensation. It's Morbin time.
Morbin time. It was everywhere.
It was everywhere. It makes you wonder, can online culture make a movie popular even if critics hate it?
It's a great example of how things have changed. It's not just about professional critics anymore. It's online communities, people making memes, talking on social media. That has power.
So Morbius, maybe not a hit with the pros, but definitely made an impact in its own weird way.
Definitely.
But let's talk about the bottom line. Box office numbers. How did these movies actually do?
Well, Venom and Let There Be Carnage both made a ton of money, more than anyone expected. They made Sony a lot of money.
So those first two Venom movies swimming in cash despite the bad reviews.
Swimming. But here's the thing. The Last Dance, still probably going to be profitable, but it didn't do as well as the first two. Opening weekend, much lower. It only made $22 million compared to the original Venom at $32 million.
Oh, wow.
And Let There Be Carnage at $37 million.
Okay, so maybe there are some cracks starting to show. Even if it's still making money, that drop for The Last Dance, that's got to be a sign for Sony, right?
Yeah, maybe people are getting tired of these movies. Maybe relying only on Spider-Man's villains isn't a long-term plan.
So where does that leave this whole Sony Spider-Man universe?
Well, the next thing they have coming up is Kraven the Hunter, which is out in December. That's actually going to be their third movie in this universe in 2024.
Wow.
And the trailer actually looked pretty cool. But given what we've seen with these movies, I don't know. Maybe we should keep our expectations in check.
It's a big moment for Sony. They've got to figure out how to keep this universe going, especially since the star of their biggest franchise is leaving.
Yeah, Tom Hardy, who plays Venom, he's said he's done. So that creates a big problem for Sony, right? Venom is their most popular character in this whole universe.
It's a tough spot. They've built everything around Venom, and now they've got to figure out what to do without him.
Yeah, it's a crossroads. Do they try to replace him,
Yeah.
risk making fans angry? Or do they move on to different characters and maybe hurt the brand they've worked so hard to build? That's what Sony's dealing with right now.
It's wild. We've got this whole universe built around Spider-Man's villains, but no Spider-Man. The movies make money, but critics hate them. And now, their biggest star is walking away. A lot going on.
It is. And it makes you think, what is Sony even trying to do? Are they happy just making popcorn movies that make money but aren't very good?
Yeah.
Or do they want to make something more? Something that's good and makes money?
Those are the big questions, and we're going to dig into those even more. But first, let's move past Venom and talk about some of the other characters in this universe, like Morbius and Madam Web.
Yeah, let's see what those characters bring to the table.
In part 2, we'll dive deep into Morbius and Madam Web. We'll look at what critics said, how audiences responded, and what they tell us about Sony's plans for this whole weird, unusual cinematic universe.
Right. We'll see how those movies, which are very different from Venom, fit into the bigger picture. And maybe then we can start to understand what Sony's really trying to do and what challenges they face building a franchise around Spider-Man's enemies.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Venom, the good, the bad, all the ups and downs, but there's more to Sony's Spider-Man universe than just, symbiotes and stuff.
Right.
They're trying to bring other characters to the big screen, and it hasn't always gone smoothly. Let's talk about Morbius. I think it's safe to say it's had a unique journey.
Yeah, Morbius is definitely a really interesting case. It kind of sums up the whole disconnect we keep seeing between what critics think and what audiences think.
For sure.
Remember, a measly 15% from critics on Rotten Tomatoes, but audiences gave it a 71%.
It feels like people either absolutely hated it or they kind of loved it for all the wrong reasons, like the whole "it's Morbin time" thing.
So,
But before we get to all that meme stuff, can we do a quick recap for anyone who might not know the comics? Like, who is Morbius?
sure. So in the comics, he's Morbius, the living vampire. Kind of a tragic character, actually. He's a scientist who, well, he's trying to cure himself of this really rare blood disease. And in the process, he accidentally turns himself into, something like a vampire. So he's always fighting this thirst for blood, trying to figure out how to reverse it.
Oh, so he's not like a straight up evil vampire.
Right. Not exactly.
Yeah.
There's definitely some depth to him, some internal struggles that could make for a really good story. But did the movie do that? Did it capture all that?
Good question.
Well, that's where the critics and the audience seem to have different opinions. The Forbes article we're talking about, it doesn't really get into Morbius too much. But if you look at what most critics said, it seems like the movie didn't really do a great job of showing how complex Morbius is.
I see.
They thought the story was too complicated, the pacing was off, the whole thing felt a little flat.
And yet, even with all that, it blew up online as a meme.
It really did.
It's like the internet took this movie that everybody thought was bad and turned it into something totally different.
It is pretty wild. The Morbius memes, it's a whole thing. It makes you think about how powerful online culture is. Even for movies that flop, it can change the conversation completely.
Absolutely. So maybe it was ironic, maybe people just wanted to be in on the joke, but something about Morbius just clicked with people online in a way it didn't with critics.
Yeah, it definitely makes you think about what it means for a movie to be successful these days. In the age of social media and all that. Like, can a movie be a success even if critics hate it, but everyone online is talking about it? And how does that affect what studios decide to make next?
Those are really good questions.
Complicated questions, for sure. But the whole Morbius thing definitely shows how movie criticism and how audiences engage with movies are changing.
Yeah, for sure.
It's not just about what professional critics say anymore.
Right.
You got to think about what's happening online with all the memes and fan stuff.
It's its own world. So, Morbius, maybe not a critical hit, but it definitely left its mark, even if it wasn't the way anyone expected. But let's move on from the world of vampires and get a little psychic.
Okay.
Madam Web, another interesting movie in Sony's little Spider-Verse here, and it has the lowest Rotten Tomatoes score out of all of them, just 11%. Yikes.
Madam Web is definitely an interesting case because it's so different from the typical superhero, like action-packed stuff. In the comics, she's usually portrayed as this, older woman, right, with these mystical powers.
Yeah.
And she kind of acts like a guise for Spider-Man.
Right. And now in the movie, we have Dakota Johnson playing her, who's definitely not an older woman. So clearly they're taking some creative liberties with the source material, I guess you could say.
Oh, for sure. And it seems like that's part of the reason why critics didn't like it. A lot of the reviewers felt like they changed the character way too much. They took Madam Web and made her more of like a typical action hero.
Hmm.
And she's not really like that in the comics. She's more this mysterious, fortune teller type.
Yeah. The article doesn't go too deep into the specifics of why critics hated it, but I did read some reviews, and it sounds like people thought the plot was really confusing, the special effects weren't that great, and it just felt like the movie didn't really know what it wanted to be.
Right. And that's a pretty common complaint you hear about a lot of these Sony Spider-Man movies. Like they can't decide if they want to stick to the comics or do something completely new.
It's like they're stuck trying to please like the hardcore comic book fans and also the regular people who just want a fun movie. And they end up not really pleasing anybody.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
It's a tough balance to find, for sure. And it seems like Sony is still trying to figure out how to do it.
So we've got Morbius, which became a meme even though critics hated it, and Madam Web, which doesn't seem to have impressed anyone, critics or audiences. It's a messy situation, Sony trying to build this whole Spider-Man-less universe.
It is. It is a little messy. But you got to remember, this whole franchise is still pretty new, right?
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, they've only put out 5 movies. They're still testing things out, figuring things out.
Right, and they have had some success, like those first 2 Venom movies did really well at the box office.
Absolutely.
But Venom, The Last Dance, seems like people are getting tired of it. And
Right.
Tom Hardy's not coming back to play Venom. Sony's got some tough decisions to make.
Yeah, they're at a turning point. What happens next with this whole universe really depends on whether they can learn from their mistakes and their successes.
That's true.
They have to figure out what people like, what critics respond to, and how to make movies that both people who love the comics and people who just want a fun movie will enjoy.
Not easy. It's a hard job. But it's not impossible. I
No.
mean, they've got all these great characters they can use, and people are obviously interested. Like, look at how much money those movies made.
Exactly.
But they've got to up their game, you know?
Yeah.
Make movies that are more than just big, dumb action.
They need to find a way to put some heart into these stories, make people actually care about these characters.
Right, and they have to figure out what to do about Spider-Man. I mean, let's be honest, it's kind of weird to have this whole thing without him. It's like they built this huge playground, but forgot to invite the most important kid.
That's the big question, isn't it? Can this universe really work without Spider-Man? Or will they eventually have to find a way to bring him in, maybe by doing a crossover with the MCU or by getting their own actor to play Spider-Man?
It's the decision that's going to make or break this whole franchise.
Mm.
But who knows? What do you think? I mean, based on what we've talked about, what do you think is going to happen next with Sony Spider-Verse?
It's hard to say, honestly. Sony keeps their plans pretty secret, but if I had to guess, I'd say they're probably looking at all their options. They're probably trying to figure out what audiences are thinking, how much money the movies are making, all that stuff to figure out the best way to move forward.
It's like they're playing this super high-stakes game of chess. They're trying to guess what everyone else is going to do while also coming up with their own master plan.
Exactly.
And if they make the right choices, they could have this huge, mega successful franchise. But if they mess up, this whole universe could fall apart.
Yeah. It's a really interesting situation to watch unfold. And it shows how the whole world of superhero movies is changing all the time. What works now might not work later, and studios have to be able to change, come up with new ideas, and take risks if they want to keep up.
Symbiotes, vampires, psychics, hunters. It's a wild world.
It is.
And the biggest question still hasn't been answered. Will Spider-Man ever actually show up?
Who knows? Only time will tell.
Eh.
But one thing's for sure. Sony's Spider-Man universe is a really interesting example of how hard it is to build a franchise based on a character everyone loves, but without actually using that character.
Okay, so we've gone over the good and the bad of Venom. We've talked about how Morbius became a meme, and we've looked at the weird, confusing world of Madam Web. But there's still one big piece left to talk about, and that's the future of this whole thing.
Exactly. We've looked at the past, but what about what's next?
Right.
In part 3, we're going to try to predict the future. We're going to look at all the different things Sony could do. Like maybe they'll focus even more on characters they already have or introduce some new ones. Maybe they'll do a crossover with the MCU, or maybe they'll just keep doing their own thing.
It's going to be a fun conversation. Lots of possibilities, lots of uncertainty, and maybe even some surprises.
Oh, yeah.
So get ready to go deep, everyone. Let's try to figure out what the future holds for Sony's Spider-Man universe. All right, deep divers, we've spent a lot of time digging into Sony's Spider-Man universe. We've seen the good, the bad, and that big question mark that is, well, Spider-Man herself.
It really is a franchise of contradictions, isn't it?
Totally.
Box office hits that critics hate. A whole universe built around a character they don't even use. So the big question now is, what's next?
That's what we're going to try to figure out in this final part. Time to put on our prediction hats and explore what the future might hold for Sony and their web-slinging stories.
This is good to me.
Let's start with the obvious. And the Forbes article doesn't really talk about this, but it's the question everyone's asking. Can this universe really work without Spider-Man?
It's hard to imagine it really reaching its full potential without him, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's the reason these villains even exist.
Yeah.
But it seems like Sony's determined to go on without him.
Yeah. They've put a lot of work into building this separate world, like their own version of the MCU, but like the opposite.
Right.
But there's no denying it. Bringing in Tom Holland's Spider-Man like a crossover, that would be huge.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
That would change everything.
Yeah.
Imagine Venom and Spider-Man actually fighting on the big screen.
Yeah.
People would go crazy for that.
And the fans are already coming up with theories. Some people even think they might bring back Andrew Garfield and give him another chance as Spider-Man, but in this new universe.
It would make a lot of people happy. A lot of fans felt like he got a raw deal.
Yeah, they didn't get to see enough of his Spider-Man.
Exactly. But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Right.
These are all just ideas.
Yeah, just fun what-ifs. For now, Sony seems focused on doing their own thing with their own Spider-Verse, and they do have options even without Spider-Man. The article mentions they want to make more movies about symbiotes, maybe leading up to a movie about Null, who's this big, bad symbiote villain.
That's interesting, especially since Tom Hardy's not going to be Venom anymore. They would need to find someone else to play Venom, or maybe focus on a different symbiote altogether.
Maybe they'll do something with the multiverse, bring in different Venoms from other realities. It would be a way to keep things fresh, you know?
And it fits with the whole multiverse thing that everyone's doing these days.
Exactly. They could also dig deeper into the stories of some of the other characters they've already used, like Kraven the Hunter. There's a lot they could do with him from the comics.
Oh, yeah. He's got a ton of history.
And they could even try again with Morbius, maybe make it darker, more like a horror movie, which is kind of how he is in the comics. And then there's Madam Web. Her first movie wasn't great, but she's got this connection to the whole Spider-Verse. She can see the future, right? So she could be important for setting up future stories, teasing new characters, making things feel more connected.
It all comes down to execution, though. They need to find people to write and direct these movies who really understand these characters. They need to make movies that are good, not just big and flashy.
Yeah, they got to prove they can do more than just explosions and special effects. They got to make movies that are smart and entertaining, something for everyone.
Exactly. It's a tough challenge. But if they can do it, if they can learn from what they've done wrong and really use all the potential of this Spider-Verse they've created, they could have something amazing.
It just goes to show you that superhero movies are always changing. There's room for different ideas, different styles, different everything. Sony doesn't have to copy Marvel to be successful. They just gotta find their own way, do what makes their universe special, and tell stories that people really connect with.
So, for you listening out there, here's something to think about. What kind of stories do you want to see from Sony's Spider-Man universe? Which characters are you most excited about? And the big question, do you think this whole thing can actually work without Spider-Man himself?
Yeah, those are some good questions to think about because in the end, whether or not Sony succeeds depends on how well they connect with the fans. They got to keep their promises, give us something even better than we expect, and create a world we want to keep coming back to.
Well, that's it for our deep dive today. But the conversation doesn't have to end here. You should definitely check out the article we talked about. It's by Paul Tassi in Forbes. And keep exploring Sony's Spider-Man universe. It's a wild world, and who knows what the future holds. Maybe we'll see you again for another deep dive into all the crazy stuff Sony's cooking up.